Welcome everyone to this evening's One Book Belgrade virtual tie-in event, proudly brought to you by the Belgrade Community Library, History of Angling and Tales from a Traveling Librarian Angler. One Book Belgrade presentations are free and open to the public thanks to a generous sponsorship by Kenyon Noble Lumber and Hardware. If you have questions about other One Book Belgrade events or our adult winter reading program, let me know and I'll help you out. Attendees to this presentation are going to be entered to win one of our many winter reading prizes, including gift certificates and book packs from the Country Bookshelf, some donated antiquarian books from the MSU Bozeman Library, courtesy of our presenter tonight, local Belgrade restaurant gift cards, and 2 fly fishing trip options from Gallatin River Guides, 1 2-person full-day float trip, and 1 2-person 2-hour walk wade fly fishing trip. And those prizes will be drawn for on April 1st. So thanks for participating tonight. My name is Sarah Creech, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the Belgrade Community Library. And before I introduce our presenter, a few Zoom tips and announcements. Attendee videos and microphones are disabled for the majority of the presentation. Questions will be taken using both the chat and the raise hand function. If you'd have a question you'd like to ask live with your voice, hit the raise hand button, and in a natural stopping point, I'll interrupt our presenter to allow you to speak your question out loud. And then if you'd like to ask your question via chat, that's also fine. Again, I'll interrupt at an appropriate time and ask the question. I'll monitor and collect chatted questions during the presentation, and the chat is also the place to let me know if you're having any technical difficulties, and I'll do my best to help you. To use that chat, click the speech bubble at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop or a desktop. If there's no toolbar visible, press the Alt key 1 time, and the chat will open on the right side of your screen if you're not in full screen mode. If you are in full screen mode, it will appear in a window you can move around by dragging that top bar. To type your message, first open the chat and click on the text that says type message here, and start typing your message, and it should appear where that text was. To send, press enter or return. To use the raise hand feature, click the hand-shaped button labeled raise hand. Once you raise your hand, I'll allow you to speak. There will be a little bit of a lag time. You have to allow your microphone to be turned on. And after you ask your question, lower your hand and I'll turn your microphone back off and we can move on with the talk. The event is being recorded, and closed captions are available for this talk from a third-party service. And to view those captions, hover over the arrow next to the closed captions button labeled CC and click Show Subtitle. And finally, please take a minute to complete the survey that will pop up at the end of the talk once the webinar ends. Completing this survey helps the library and our sponsors know what programs bring the most interest, and it helps us improve every time. And since we can't see your faces, it helps us to know if you enjoyed the presentation. So a little bit about our presenter tonight. He is the Special Collections Librarian at MSU Bozeman Library. He works primarily with the libraries and trout and salmonid collections and efforts. This is a great fit since he's also an avid angler. He started fishing as a child on the rivers and lakes of northern Wisconsin and has continued to pursue his love of angling through his life. He has fished in over 30 countries and has been lucky to land fish on 6 continents. Along the way, he has learned a lot about himself, angling, and even had a few adventures with crocodiles and tigers, some of which we might hear tonight. He is currently working on his dissertation, which is to study a study on the motivations and concerns of anglers the world over. Please give a warm, albeit silent, welcome to our presenter, James Thull. And now it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to you, Jim. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and just resume the slideshow here. Well, thanks everybody for being here today. As you've seen and heard from the title of the talk, I'll speak a little bit about angling history and how it is intertwined with human culture. about some of the adventures I've had fishing around the world, and finally about our angling collections at MSU. So everything that walks, flies, crawls, or slithers on land descends from something that swam. Not only is human blood mostly water, but the watery portion of our blood has a concentration of salt and other ions that is remarkably similar to seawater. The ocean still flows through our veins with every beat of our hearts. Humans are connected to water and to the life that lives there. Fresh water, which represents just 1% of the Earth's total water volume, is essential to our survival. As the saying goes, water is life. Humans need access to fresh potable water, and there's a limited supply. Some economists even argue that in the not too distant future, it'll be as valuable as oil or gold. So our connections to fish, fishing, and water are ingrained in us at a primordial level. So I'm going to let someone now you recently read, open for me with an answer when asked about what fishing means to him. And this is from our Angling Oral History Project, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit.
Yeah, I'll preface that. You know, as a writer, I've tried to put it into words many times, you know, what fishing means to me. And I remember something, when I was growing up, my favorite fishing writer was Al McLean. And in one of his books, he wrote something about a mountain is a fact, a trout is a moment of, you know, like poetry that only the angler can see. And so I'll start this, if you don't mind, just read you 2 paragraphs of something that I wrote trying to figure out what fishing means to me, and then I'll tell you a story that...
Please do.
So this is a chapter called The Kiss of Death, and this is from my 4th book, Crazy Mountain Kiss. People fish for different reasons. They fish to shed the cataracts of age, to relive the thrill that was the dancing of a bobber as a sunfish nipped the worm, and that 30 years later is hearkened by the rising of a trout to a mayfly. They fish because a cast is a prayer for the believer and a hope for the heathen, and the more casts you make, the more likely your prayer will be answered or your hope be realized. And they fish because a fish is a miracle of nature, its fins as wondrous as the wings of a bird, and because you can touch the one but not the other. Though he could not have expressed it if asked the question, and there was no one around to ask along the stretch of the Madison he drove to the next morning, what Sean Stranahan fished for were a series of moments. The wings of caddisflies pulsed over the river like dust motes and shafts of sunlight when Stranahan's imitation vanished in a swirl. That was one moment. Another came when the trout leapt, and a third when the leader tippet snapped. Stranahan waded to the bank and sat down, consoling himself with the thought that a fish lost is still a moment caught, for the hollow feeling that is counterpoint to the elation upon netting a fish remains an essential touchstone of the sport. Or so he told himself. The trout will make a philosopher out of you, especially a big one. So, in this series of mystery books I write, Penguin allows me to write 2 or 3 little short fishing scenes a book. And so sometimes I write something like that, trying to see what it means to me. So when you ask this question, you know, what story? I start thinking, well, you know, I should just see what comes to mind quickest. And I can remember when I was a much younger adult, and I was sort of caught in that swirl of life after you get married and you have children and your life sort of almost can spin out of control. And it was fall, and I drove up into Canada, having never caught a steelhead before, at least not on fly. And I drove 2 days to the Maurice River, which is a tributary to the Great Bulkley River. And I was sick the entire drive up. I had a fever, and I never stopped driving for 2 days until I got to the bank of that river. And I didn't even know how to fish for steelhead. I didn't know you could swing a fly and catch a steelhead. All I knew was that you could drop a fly down and maybe a fish would eat it. And purple was a good color, so I had a purple fly. And I just kept doing this with it and walking down the bank. and I saw this huge silver boil, and I thought, oh my God, you know, that's got to be a steelhead. And I didn't hook it, but an hour later, I hooked a big steelhead, and I caught it. And I can remember, you know, thinking, oh my gosh, you know, that great circle that fish has made through the oceans to be able to come back, and I'm able to see that, you know, far staring eye and touch it, if only for a moment. And it took me like completely out of myself, and so I made my camp right there on the river, which is a place called Bymark. And I could see that night I could see the northern lights through the wall of the tent, and so I got out and I climbed on top of the hood of my truck so I could see it better. And it was like this instant moment of like wonder and calm, and to me that sort of epitomized what fishing could do for you in almost a sort of a healing way. And that was the first story that came to mind. And then I thought, well, there's one other story which I think is important, which is when I took my son Tom fishing for salmon on a little coastal river in Washington. We were fishing with bait, you know, which is basically roe. And I said, I didn't know what I was doing. I was a fly fisher. I said, I think you do it like this. And I flipped the spinning rod, you know, flipped that and flipped it in, and it went by. And about a 35-pound king ate it and jumped out of the water 8 feet from the bank. And I looked around to find Tom, and he had backed up like 20 feet away. And he said, and he couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, he said, we're going to need a bigger rod. I'll never forget that. And then he fished, and he hooked a giant king salmon himself 2 days later after fishing at least 8 hours for it. And he lost it. But it was like, well, what a wonderful, you know, sort of moment of wonder for a kid. And he still remembers that. Anyway, those are two of the things that came to mind when you asked me that.
All right. Well, I think that's a great intro. Keith telling us a little story. I'll make sure this is still going. I believe it is. So that was part of our angling oral history project, which again, I'll talk more about a little later. As you already know, I'm an angler myself. And as you've heard, I've been lucky enough to actually catch fish on 6 continents now, where I've had incredible experiences and met amazing people. If I have one claim to fame, it's that the Mekong giant catfish I caught in Thailand was bigger than the one that Jeremy Wade caught. Jeremy, for those of you who don't know, was the host of the TV program River Monsters. I was lucky enough to meet and fish with him, and he is just a super cool guy. He came out and did a lecture for us a few years back. He is as gracious of a celebrity as I've ever met. I hosted him, brought him around town. We'd go out for lunch, go out for dinner, wherever we went, people would come up to him and ask for a photograph or an autograph or what have you. And he was just as kind and gracious as could be about it. Just a really nice guy. I started fishing when I was just a kid. One of my earliest memories is of my mother taking me to a fishing tournament at Stevenson Island on the Menominee River, which is the river that serves as the border between Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I was young, 5, 6 years old maybe, and I fished a little closed reel spinning rod with a bait and a bobber. And the idea was just to catch some little rock bass, little rock fish. But I must have my line set too low or something. And so I was more fishing the bottom, which allowed me to catch a dogfish. I remember thinking, I still remember this real vividly too. I remember thinking I was snagged. And then the fish started to pull, and I knew there was life on the end of the line. And that's what seemed like, after what seemed like a pretty epic battle to a young kid, I landed a dogfish. It was probably 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet. At least that's what they said it was, a dogfish. I don't really recall, but it could have been a carp or another bottom feeder. But I do know I did win a little trophy for the largest fish caught in the tournament. Regardless, though, from that point on, I've really loved to fish. I love the mystery of the water, this kind of life-giving force that held so many secrets beneath its surface. How deep, how fast, what creatures live there? I think that's what I still love about it today. While you can sight fish in clear water, learn to read water, and know where fish are likely to be, it is still a mystery that will always surprise you. In many ways, that dogfish is responsible for a lifetime spent in fishing, has helped shape my career and taken me around the world. Humans have been harvesting fish for at least 40,000 years. Some of the earliest evidence comes from East Timor, where fish bones and hooks have been found in caves used by our common ancestors. And this is not an isolated incident. We have evidence of early Native Americans harvesting salmon for at least 7,500 years and oral traditions that go back much further, and have found fish bones in early human settlements the world over. The evolution of our human societies can even in some ways be tied to angling and its importance. The travels across the Pacific by early peoples may very well have been a search for fertile fishing grounds, or perhaps just lost fishers who discovered new lands by the chance of following the tides. Around the world, people have settled and built lives and societies around and near water. It is reasonable to assume that some of this was in part due to the fish that could be found there. Paris, Rome, Alexandria, Baghdad, Vienna, etc., all settled on rivers. While transport and access to water were undoubtedly major factors, it is unlikely fish did not also play a role, or at least were a happy coincidence. Beyond the physical evidence, there are multiple examples of angling in literature. The first written mention of fly fishing comes from the Romans, who in around 200 BC recorded the way the Macedonians fished on the Atreus River. The Macedonians were using flies, tying red wool around 2 feathers, is the way it's described. Their rods were about 6 feet long, and so were their lines. The Romans were apparently impressed enough to document it, which leads me to something I find interesting, and that is while there are a lot of ways to fish, including traps, hand lines, spears, slides, bait, etc., the methods often used by Aboriginal peoples around the world are often similar. The comparison between tenkara fishing in Japan and the way the Romans described the Macedonian methods, I think is really interesting. Spearfishing in the Pacific Islands, across the Americas, and even Scotland, again, there's a lot of similarities. And of course, fish traps and nets, which have been used all around the world by peoples. And I just find those similarities that we kind of all, depending on where we were, kind of came to the same conclusion how the best way to catch a fish was. Some of the earliest fishing nets discovered were found in Finland and date to about 8,500 BC. Several Native American tribes used nets going back likely even farther in time. Again, it is one of those human connections. I've seen images of early anglers harvesting with nets, and it reminded me distinctly of how as a child growing up in northern Wisconsin, I used to go out with my uncles and harvest smelt runs in northern Wisconsin in a very similar way. We'd use depth nets and pole nets. The smelt runs are actually an example of why we as anglers and those who love wild areas need to be vigilant. We need to care about the environment. We need to question state policies and always put the long-term environmental impacts over our short-term economic gains. In the late 1970s and early 80s, smelt were kind of deemed basically limitless, and there were no real regulations on commercial harvesting of them. And they were basically harvested to a point of almost no return. I mean, we used to go out and just get pails of them pretty easily. And nobody even goes anymore. But in the last 20 years, if you go out and see 4 or 5 smelt in a night, you're lucky. And the damage that it did to the Great Lakes can almost not be overstated. When the smelt population crashed, so did the populations of fish that preyed on them, like lake perch, etc., and the larger predators. So I think it's just one of those examples that I've personally witnessed in my lifetime where sometimes the damage we can do as humans, it's real hard to undo. And so it's better to be vigilant and not let the problem occur than it is to try to recover from it. So another book that's rife with talk of fishing, of course, is the Bible. Several of Christ's early followers were career fishermen. And Christ even related himself to anglers when he said, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." As we recorded more of our histories and our lives, we also recorded more information about fishing. One of the earliest works from the Western world, a treatise of fishing with an angle, was reportedly written by Dame Julia Burns in 1496. However, historians have found little evidence to prove that she was indeed the author. regardless of who is responsible for the work. It both demonstrates the instructional aspect of angling writing and the importance of angling culture that are found throughout the works that follow. One of the most celebrated works on fishing, The Complete Angler by Isaac Walton and Charles Cotton, flows very much in this vein and provides both instruction and the cultural importance of angling through the lyrical arguments made by the piscator to his fellow sporting enthusiast. The first edition of this book, published in 1653, was written by Walton alone, and it was not until the fifth edition, published in 1676, that Cotton's material was included. And of course, hundreds of writers have followed in the footsteps of those early authors. It is said there are more books written on fishing than all other sports combined. There's even a story of Cleopatra taking Antony fishing. It's said that one day that Cleopatra took Antony fishing on the Nile on her barge, accompanied by a flotilla of smaller fishing boats. Everyone pulled up a good number of Nile perch on their lines except Antony. Feeling humiliated in front of his mistress, he determined not to be skunked again. He devised a plan that the second day secretly paid several fishermen to dive underwater and place their own freshly caught fish on his hook. Over the next few hours, Antony drew up fish after fish. The Egyptians marveled at the heap of fish that he landed on the deck and wondered how he got so good at it. Cleopatra figured it out, and she feigned admiration and crowed over what a natural fisherman he was, boasting that his haul would be even more impressive the next day. She invited everyone back out for a day of fishing, and this time she played her own trick. As soon as Antony let down a line, she had one of her servants dive under and fix a large salted fish from the Black Sea on Antony's hook. He pulled it up, and everyone looked at it and realized that it had been dead for quite a while and certainly did not belong in the Nile. As Plutarch comments, you can imagine the guffaws and hoots that ensued. Cleopatra mischievously diverted Antony's irritation with flattery. Apparently, she said, "Better to leave fishing to us poor Egyptians. Your game is conquering kingdoms." Likely not a true story, but still, I think it's really interesting that a tale of angling was preserved and told at all. One of the other things I really love about angling and its history is its common thread throughout human cultures. All races, religions, cultures, societies in this world fish and have fished throughout time. Native American tribes, particularly those on the coast, often built their entire societies around fishing and the migration of fish. The Yakima, Nez Perce, and several of the Columbia River tribes are known collectively as the Salmon people, or Wakinush. I've heard the argument made that art, like totem poles, are the result of salmon runs. Because so much food could be harvested, it allowed people to have the time to create art and beauty for beauty's sake. In my travels, I've also discovered that angling is a universal language. I've had instant connections with people all over the world. Once I started talking about fish and fishing with them, it is a common thread that connects us as human beings. We all experience that rush of excitement at the tug on our line, the peace and solitude of being on a body of water with nothing but our thoughts, and the pride and accomplishment of luring a great leviathan and managing to land it out of its watery depths. I recall an angler one time telling me a story about going to Pakistan. Being from the US, they were a bit cold towards him at the border until a guard saw a fishing pole in his luggage. He claims that within an hour, he was invited back to the guard's home where the guard wanted to show him pictures of fish that he caught. They couldn't speak the same language, but they had this connection at a human level that I just find amazing. This has been my experience as well. I have met and stayed in touch with anglers from around the world. Just last week, I got a photo from a friend's recent catch in the Ukraine, and that was a similar situation. He was a guide that I had hired and interviewed through a translator there, and he took me out fishing. We did not connect at a language level at all. We weren't able to speak, but we were able to communicate through fishing. I want to share a little story now from another one from our Anglo History project. This is Trevor Sidhull, who is a Zulu guide in South Africa. And he is talking about, let me find the question I want to do here. Is there cross-cultural camaraderie between anglers?
Yes, it does happen. There is a guy I once fished with I met a guy in a river. I didn't know the guy, he didn't know me. And so I went to him. Apparently the guy couldn't speak English or Zulu, of which those are the two languages I can speak. And then there was only one language between the two of us that we could speak. It was just fishing. For about 3 hours, we were fishing. We shared fishing together. I fished his rod, he fished my rod, selected 1 or 2 flies from his boxes. He had 1 or 2 flies from my box, but we still couldn't speak the same language, but the language of fishing itself, and which was kind of great. And then eventually, after 2-3 hours of fishing, his friend came, and well, that's when we started communicating, because his friend knew English, and we started communicating in English.
All right, I just think that's a great little story about how kind of that common thread can connect us. All right, so here in Montana, the history of angling goes back thousands of years. Certainly, the first European explorers spoke to the abundance of fish in our rivers. The Lewis and Clark journals mentioned harvesting fish on several occasions. While on the Missouri near Great Falls, they caught West Slope cuts and described them in the journals as precisely resembling our mountain or speckled trout in form and the position of their fins. But the specks on these are of a deep black instead of the red or gold color of those common to the United States. These are furnished long, sharp teeth on the palate and tongue and have generally a small dash of red on each side behind the front ventral fins. The flesh is of a pale yellowish red, or when in good order, of a rose red. Later, let me see if we're still playing here. I think so. Later in July, while camped near the Jeffersons, some of the men hauled the fish net across the river but caught none any other way but with a hook and line. Hook and line fishing was mediocre the next day as well, and hunting was worst. However, on the 22nd, their luck changed when the Indians, very kind and friendly, helped them make a fish drag out of willows. They tied bunches of them together and made it long enough to reach across the river. And caught with it, they claimed 520 different fish. And then they shared those and divided them between the Native Americans to help them themselves. One of the earliest recorded Yellowstone fishing stories comes from the Cook Folsom Peterson expedition in 1869. We have the original account here in our archives, which is pretty neat. It's a wonderful little story. There's lots of little tales of fishing in it, in addition to the expedition through the park itself. But my favorite story is about how they saw fish rising in one of the lakes, but they were too far out to get to with their rods. So they cut down a lodgepole pine and put it on like a little turret and dropped lines off of that to be able to catch fish. I just think it's a neat story. Fishing in Montana is wonderful. It's a billion-dollar industry and a reason why many people visit or even move here. But of course, it's not without concerns. And if we wish to keep it, we need to be vigilant. Climate change, invasive species, disease, and overfishing are just a few of the threats we face. Invasive species are tied directly often to climate change. Fish, bacteria, plants, and predators that once could not handle Montana winters are slowly moving north. They will displace our native and wild fish when they get here. While we often think of our state's waters as being pristine, untouched, and unspoiled by man, in many respects, they are the nature that we envision, the nature we've created. Brook trout, brown trout, and rainbow trout do not belong in our rivers, yet they far outnumber our native cuts. Why? Because we like to fish for them. They can survive and thrive here, so they have been introduced across the land. Well, of course, it is not just in Montana where anglers have changed the landscape to introduce invasive species. There are no native trout or salmonids in the Southern Hemisphere at all. So those incredible fishing grounds in New Zealand, Australia, Argentina, Chile, South Africa are all really manufactured. We introduced trout to those waters and forever changed them. What's done is done. I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing that I don't love fishing in these places. I absolutely do. I'm just acknowledging that if nature had her way, those places with those fish would not exist. And then clearly, introducing these top predators change the ecosystems and displace native species. We tend to often make mistakes with bucket biology, and time will tell if we've made one introducing trout around the world. Another example is, of course, Lake Yellowstone and lake trout introduced there. While I love fishing for lake trout, fishing for and harvesting lake trout, I would trade that opportunity there for the return of the healthy cutthroat populations that once called the lake home. That is really an ongoing battle in Yellowstone. And well, I think they're making headway. I'm not sure if we're going to win that. Another argument often made is that in some lakes there were no fish, so what harm would introduction have caused? A biologist at Rocky Mountain National Park reminded me that just because there were no fish, that does not mean that there wasn't a complex and established ecosystem there that had naturally developed. And to be clear, I'm not arguing for the removal of non-native trout from Montana or anywhere else, but I do think we need to establish and keep some waters safe for our native fish. How the invasive species got here in many places around the world was often rooted in good intentions. Something introduced as a food source or just a reminder of home. There were also in the 19th century acclimation societies here in the United States and abroad that actively sought to introduce game fish and other deemed useful plants and animals around the country and the world in order to increase access to resources everywhere. Fisheries in general are in decline the world over. One of the things Jeremy Wade I mentioned was our lecturer a few years back. And he opened his talk by apologizing. He said his television program makes it look like you can go anywhere in the world and just land these huge, massive fish, and it's just not the case. They are in the decline everywhere. Many species of fish have been decimated from overfishing, pollution, climate change, and the impact of invasive species. Atlantic salmon, sturgeon, bull trout, smelt, cod, swordfish, tuna, and eels are just a few of the species whose populations are kind of mere shadows of what they once were. The decline is happening in every ocean on every continent. While there is hope and there have been limited success stories, there is no way to sugarcoat the current state of fisheries. Pollution has destroyed habitats. The Black Sea, often called the world's most polluted sea, was once one of the most prolific fisheries on Earth. Invasive species like snakehead, Asian carp, and trout in some places have been spread to distant corners of the Earth and impacted native species and ecosystems. And overfishing has brought species like cod, sturgeon, and Atlantic salmon to a point where the species may not return without concerted multinational efforts. In addition, there are threats such as open ocean fish farming. I did some interviews in Iceland a while back, and one of the interviews I remember them talking about the offshore pens contain enough non-native fish that a single major release would basically destroy native populations. They did have one limited release of a pen, and they mapped it. They were able to show around the continent where the release was, and going around, or not the continent, the island, around the island where they started spotting rainbows coming up their streams to migrate. Anyway, so climate change is also responsible for destroying ecosystems on a global scale, as well as a wealth of other things. The bleaching of the coral reefs in Australia and Florida are just one example of the impact. In addition to all these issues, anglers, who are often advocates for preserving fish habitats, a lot of us are aging. And the coming generations, not just in fishing, but they're not participating in outdoor sports like angling, hunting, hiking, things like that, in the numbers they once did. What concerns me kind of at a personal level is we all know there is a difference between seeing a picture of a waterfall or a pristine forest or feeling the water on your toes in a cold mountain stream. And, you know, so being there and just seeing an image of it. And I think once you're there, it forms a connection with you, and you're more interested in preserving and keeping that, and you see the value of it. And I don't know if we just see that on our video screens or on computers or what have you, if we're going to have that same connection, if maybe in 20 years people are going to care whether we drill for oil in Yellowstone or mine for gold or what have you. I'm not sure, but it is a concern I have. So while there are arguably grave concerns for the future of fisheries, there are also opportunities and time to change the path we're on. As with any movement, an active, loud, and persistent voice is often what can lead to changes. And collective organizations are more efficient at being that voice than individuals. The Angler Learner History Project has interviewed members and leadership of angling organizations like Trout Unlimited and Fly Fishers International, and asked participants about the effect of these organizations have had. Organizations like these and other environmental groups, like the Nature Conservatory, represent our best hope for changing public opinion and advocating for effective legislation. I think one of the things we do as humans often, and to our detriment, is we put short-term economic gains over long-term environmental impacts. And I just think it can be, and we've done it across, it's not limited to a race or a nation or anything else, but we've done it across the globe. And oftentimes the cleanups, the undoing the damage is so much more difficult than if it was just never done in the first place. Anyway, we are going to get serious about saving fish and making our waters healthy again. It will need to be a global effort with laws that are enforceable and a change in public opinion and diet. Law should reflect the sustainability of a species and what can be harvested without causing harm versus what the market deems profitable. The current issue is that waters are connected, and what hurts one has effects that reverberate beyond the nation's borders. The oceans are largely a wild west in terms of the laws, and without a united effort, there will be no change. I've talked with fishermen around the world, but I remember particularly off the coast of Africa, they talked about in Senegal and Ivory Coast, they talked about, the fishermen there talked about just how their harvests have been decimated because these massive long-range harvesters, trawlers from Japan and Russia and places like that, come in and just kind of sweep the sea clean. And they're clearly breaking laws, but the fines to break the law are at a point where it doesn't matter. They can just work that in. Their profits are at such where they can pay the fine and still do really well. Other issues that can be solved relatively easily with a simple change in approach. Fish farms, while they can be a threat, can also be done sustainably and help meet the demand for fish as a food source, which can allow wild species on the brink to return to healthy populations. Many of the invasive species that threaten natives, like lionfish in Florida or the snakehead in the Potomac, are also delicious, and adding them to our menu would satisfy a dietary need and keep a dangerous species in check. One way anglers can help preserve healthy populations is to practice catch and release. Many of the oral history participants from around the world have spoken to the importance of catch and release in helping to preserve game fish and improve angling opportunities. While I do release about 90% of the fish I catch, sometimes I do question the practice a bit. Is it ethical to hook some, and some would say kind of torture, a fish slowly for the pleasure of it? Basically, is harvesting a fish you hook more ethical than releasing it? Should we fish for things we don't intend to eat or harvest? One of the things I've seen with guides around the world is just their complete shock that after I catch a fish, I want to let it go. I personally have mixed feelings on this, but feel harvesting as well as catch and release both have a place in angling, and that is a practice that can help preserve our native fish. And to be fair, catch and release was something I came around to. When I was younger, I kept nearly everything I caught, including that dogfish. Anyway, so I don't want to give the impression that anglers have destroyed the wilderness, because I do not think that is true. And in many ways, anglers are a large vocal group fighting to preserve our wild areas, even if it is kind of for selfish reasons. That's okay. Anglers see things while fishing that cause them to have similar concerns about the future of angling and the environment, and have common and nearly universal reasons why they fish. They notice what flowers are in bloom, the type and number of insects, the flow and temperature of the water, development, and an abundance of other things. They also take note of how those things affect fishing over time. By detailing their experiences in journals, sharing information with state agencies, and helping to mitigate damage when they see it, anglers can have a real-world impact on preserving fisheries and wild areas. Destination angling, if done correctly, is another way anglers help to keep fish species healthy and wild areas wild. We've seen some great stories from around the world with helping preserve bonefish, mahseer, salmon, trout. The monies that can be brought in can impact local communities in a positive way, and really helps form a partnership between those who can afford to travel to fish and the native fish that can, and the native peoples that can benefit everyone involved. Everybody wins. I've interviewed guides and community leaders in Zambia, India, Peru, and several other places around the world where destination angling has largely been credited with preserving healthy waters and fish. When locals directly benefit and are hired as guides or in the hospitality service, the fish in the water become more valuable and beneficial to them than they would at the marketplace. As the Special Collections Librarian here at MSU, I work primarily with our Trout and Salmonid collection. And because of this, I've got to do some really cool things and meet some wonderful people. I'd like to begin this section where I talk a little bit about some of my adventures and what we do at MSU by giving a shout out to our former Dean of the Library, Bruce Morden, who along with Bud Lilly started, that's why you see so many pictures of Bud in here, started our efforts to collect these materials. But Bud was instrumental in getting these efforts underway. And it's fair to say that our collections would not likely exist without his efforts. Bud was a great guy. He became a really good friend of mine, and I'm proud to say that he taught me to fly fish. Although the way I cast, I'm confident he would not be proud to say that he taught me to fly fish. In addition to help getting our collection effort started, our Angling Oral History project was really inspired by Bud. The MSU Library Angling Oral History project was started approximately 8 years ago with the aim of capturing, preserving, and disseminating information on the culture of angling on a global scale. It's grown to include more than 300 interviews from participants on 6 continents and more than 60 nations. The data, which is all open access, documents angling culture, climate change, pollution, fish stocking, the impact of national parks, and often the effect of unexpected historical events, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall and the effects of the revolution in the nation formerly known as Rhodesia. The project began with a story. Bud when he was guiding, I think this is in the 70s or 80s, he told me a story about taking an elderly man who was in poor health fishing when he was guiding still, obviously. Anyway, the man had trouble walking, couldn't really see that well, but could still cast a fly. After Bud directed him where to cast, he hooked and landed a brown trout. And I'm paraphrasing this. It's written down somewhere, but I'm just paraphrasing this. So this isn't an exact quote. As Bud was releasing the fish, anyway, the guy hooked and landed a nice brown. As Bud was releasing the fish, he noticed that the man was taking his rod apart. He told them the fish were still rising and they could catch more. The man looked at Bud and simply said, "That's right, but that's as fine a fish as I've ever caught, and that's the last one I'll ever catch. Let's go home." He died just a few weeks later. He knew he was in poor health. He knew he was on his way out, but angling was something he loved, fishing was something he loved, and he wanted to experience it one more time. I know, it was a powerful story, and it really struck me, and it made me think about what fishing meant to me and to our society. Like the man in the story, it's important to me and something I've done my entire life. So, and I thought we should document this. So I brought it to my dean, I brought it to Bud, and we started small, and it's grown. From this simple beginning, the project has grown to a truly international scale. I've interviewed people like Jeremy Wade and Tom McGuane, but I've also interviewed subsistence fishermen in Cambodia and Ivory Coast and Costa Rica. We are capturing, preserving, and disseminating information that would likely be lost without the effort, and very much helping to preserve the memory of angling in our time on a global scale. I've heard some great stories along the way, as well as some amazing accounts of history. Masaoki tells a story. He's a Japanese-American man who lived through World War II. When he was, I think, 10 years old, he was imprisoned in a Japanese internment center in California. And there was a little creek that flowed through the camp. He told me a story about how they used to go down there with safety pins and try to catch fish with little pieces of orange peel. And the guards would walk by and they'd petrify them, they'd just freeze. So one day they were all around the creek, and the guard walked by and he pointed over to Moss and he said, "Hey, you come over here." And Moss was scared. He walked over, but he said he just kind of froze. And the guard looked at him and grabbed something out of his pack and handed it to him. And he said, "This is for you." And it was some fishing hooks and lines and some little sticks that they could turn into rods. I just thought it's a beautiful story. I've talked with, as I mentioned, I talked with people in Zimbabwe who talked about the revolution there and about how when, I'm not going to remember the gentleman's name now, basically took over all the white farmers' land, and about how they were evicted. And he said, I was born here. My father was born here. And it was just a real personal story to him. I've talked with people in East Germany about, before the wall went down, about one of the prized things to sneak across the border was fish hooks. In Cambodia, I talked with a woman who talked about, told me a story about her mother living under Pol Pot in the Khmer Rouge. For any angler and for any anglers in the audience tonight, please check the project out and consider sitting down with me for an interview. We'd love to have your story preserved as well. So moving on from the Angling Oral History Project, we also collect books. We have the world's largest collection of books on trout and salmonids, 13,000 plus volumes now. We do not limit by anything other than really species. So we've got books in a ton of languages, French and Latin and German and Deutsch, and well, German is Deutsch, Russian, etc. Geography doesn't matter to us. We'll collect information on fish wherever they're at. Certainly, the subject, it's all about the species, but we collect books, fiction. So we have Keith's books, for instance. We have poetry. We have art books. We have things on game laws, which I think are pretty interesting in that the game laws in particular, and we have those going back to the 1600s, you can really track the health of a body of water through game laws and bag limits. Track invasive species. When did brook trout or something else start to become regulated in a certain place? I just think it's an interesting thing. We're not, to clarify, we're not a fly fishing library. We have lots on fly fishing, but we're really about the species. We have lots and lots of rare books, but again, we're not a rare book library. We're really a research library. Some of the cool rare books, wherein I'll invite everybody out there to come in for a tour of our collection. We do have a book that is published in the mid-1600s that is signed by Isaac Walton. So if you come in for a tour, I will let you hold in your hand something that Isaac Walton held in his. We have the oldest book held by any library in the state of Montana, the Roman Polyglotus, which is about fishing primarily. It's a report about fishing in Rome, but in passing, they mention reports coming from the New World about the abundance of fish. And it's a cool little thing. There's about 12 copies that exist, and one of them's right here in Bozeman. We also actively collect DVDs, which in children's books. The children's books I think are cool because we all have those lessons that we took away from those books that we read as a kid. And what I really think is neat is looking at how the evolution of those. So they start out in the 50s, they're coming home with little red wagons full of trout and fish, and it's all about harvesting and taking that fish and conquering it. And you look at stuff today, and it's really all about how that fish lives in that ecosystem and how important part it is, and catch and release and all that kind of good stuff. The DVDs and video cassettes are also, I think, really cool in that, just that fishing trip going down the Snake, or learning how to tie one of AK's flies or something like that, I think is pretty neat. But often, especially those fishing trips, what I think is neat is the information that's captured that wasn't the subject, wasn't the topic. How much development is there alongside that river? What type of gear are they using? How do the banks look? What type of boat are they using? What's the weather like? Do you see Canadian thistle in the 1999 video, but not the 1970 video? Things like that, I think, are pretty neat, and it will be a really great research tool going forward. One of the other things that we also have, probably the world's largest collection of, is archival papers. So archival papers are what we call primary source documents. They're really the basis of all research. And we have some incredible stuff. We have John Garrock's papers, A.K. Best, Bud Lilly, of course. Hopefully we're going to have Keith's papers. Keith and I have talked about that for years, and I think I'm hopeful, keeping my fingers crossed, that happens as well. We have Nick Lyons, Bob Jacklin, Tom Morgan, Ed Engel, just a wealth of people. And what's really cool is you can come in, for instance, like with Garrock's first books, you can come in and look at the legal pads where he wrote those out longhand. You can come in and see the telegraph that Bud Lilly sent home after he found out he was coming home after World War II. The pictures he took in Hiroshima when he was visited there right after the end of the war, they dropped the bomb. Some really incredible stuff. One of the other things that we have here at MSU is our annual lecture series. We do an annual Trout and Salmonid lecture series. Some of the images with naked people and fish in there were from a presentation last year that Henry Hughes did. Henry's written Backseat with Fish, several other things, and really talked about sensuality in fishing. It was a really interesting talk. We've also had Jeremy Wade, who I've mentioned, Martha Williams, who's the current head of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in Montana, and Nathaniel Reed. Nathaniel Reed is an incredibly interesting guy. He was Undersecretary of the Interior for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks under, I believe, Nixon and Ford. He traveled the world, was in the OSA in World War II, just a real interesting guy. He helped write things like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. Just a really interesting, cool guy. So those are kind of our major efforts. We also have a trout database where we keep digital trout images and things like that. And then I just thought I'd share a couple of stories about fishing around the world. So a couple of my favorite that I like to tell are my run-in with a crocodile, which I do have a picture of a crocodile in this slideshow. I was in Uganda and I was fishing one of the headwaters of the Nile, not paying attention, just had my rod in my hand and I was looking out at the water. And also my guide just started yelling at me and ran up behind me and grabbed me and pulled me back maybe 15, 20 feet from the bank, pointed, and maybe about 15 feet, not even, maybe about 8, 10 feet off of the bank, there was probably about a 12-foot croc. And it was looking right at me, with just kind of its nostrils and its eyes above the water. And the guide was like, he was stalking you. He was getting ready to strike you. And I would have been toast. That thing would have taken me down like nothing. Anyway, we kind of waited a little while, tossed a rock or two in the water. The croc took off. I mean, we didn't hurt him or anything, but just kind of scared him away. My guide was like, do you want to keep fishing? I made a couple more tentative casts, but my heart was just kind of out of it for the day. It freaked me out. I stepped over a puff adder one time when I was in South Africa. They're really lazy, big snakes, but also really poisonous. That freaked me out. And then I have a tiger story. I was fishing in India on the banks of the Ramnagar River. And we started hearing the monkeys make an alarm sound. And my guide was like, oh, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's just a leopard, which maybe should have been a clue. But a few seconds, just shortly after those words left his lips, he was kind of around a bend from me. So he was a little farther back and didn't actually see it, but right next, 20 feet away, full-grown Bengal tiger walked out of the jungle. He walked out, he looked at me, he kind of snarled, didn't really seem to mind me that much, bent his head down, got a drink of water, walked around the bank, and then walked back in. I was just petrified. One thing I will say to you is that a full-grown Bengal tiger looks a heck of a lot bigger when it's 20 feet away from you than it does on TV or in a zoo or something like that. They're massive animals. And I was definitely nervous about it, but came away unscathed, which was great. I've been lucky enough to fish in a lot of places. I've caught trout at 13,000 feet in the Andes, pike in Ukraine, perch in Germany, Mekong giant catfish in Thailand, brown trout in New Zealand. I didn't catch any tigerfish when I was in Zambia, but I did catch a breed. Snakehead in the Philippines. And then I've caught some weird things. Like I was fishing in Belize and I caught a remora, one of those ones that stick to the side of a shark. I mean, who catches a remora? It was a little trippy. Anyway, so those are some of my stories, a little bit about some of the adventures that I have. I do want to, I'll just say this on my way out, and then I do want to end with one more little clip from the England Oral History Project, a great story with AK talking about fishing. So thank you for your time. If you have questions after AK's story, I'll be happy to answer them. And one of the things I really want you to remember is that MSU is a land-grant institution. We are your university and your library. Anybody can walk through our doors and use any of the materials and resources that we have available. So please, if you're an angler, please consider, reaching out to me to do an interview. But if you just like it, or if you know anglers or just interested in old books, if you want to come in for a tour of our Trout and Salmonid collection, I'll be happy to provide one for you. Right now, we're only doing it by appointment, but hopefully at some point in the future, we'll get back to our normal, like life was pre-COVID. And you can just walk in any of our open hours, and I'll be happy to provide a tour. So if you have any interest in just fishing, seeing some old books, talking about angling in far off corners of the world or right in our own backyard, please come and see me. I'd be happy to have a chat with you. I thank you for sitting through this. I hope you enjoyed at least some of the stories or some of the information. And I'm going to end here with A.K. Best telling us about what fishing means to him.
I have met my spirit in the Michigan woods. This will take a little while. I fished Hunt Creek many times when we lived there, and I'd fish it twice a week once the season opened. I'd even take my camper over and camp there for a week 2 or 3 times a summer. Michigan is a series of old ancient sandbars, these ridges, and there's cedar swamps. And I got to the point one year where I would walk over to the next ridge to see and follow that down to the swamp and then cut back to the stream. And every few days I would go to the next ridge. And one day I'm on the 3rd ridge and I come down to the same cedar swamp. And I'm peering through the cedars and the alders, and it looks like there's an open spot in there. And I'm curious, so I thought, well, I wonder what's in there. So I pulled my rod apart, held it together with a rubber band on each end, and pawed my way through there. And I had just lit my full bent pipe. I used to smoke a pipe a lot because it keeps the mosquitoes away. I walked in there, and there was an area flat as a pancake with nothing on it but grass. In the twilight light, it was the color of jade, golden jade, just glistening. And all the birch and all the cedars were forming what looked almost like a cathedral ceiling. And all at once, I felt I was not alone. And this warm, comfortable feeling engulfed me to the point where I fell on my knees and I shut my eyes. And I felt like I should reach out, but I was afraid I'd get someplace and not be able to get back. When I opened my eyes, it was dark. My pipe bowl was cold. I had to get my compass out to make sure I was headed straight west to find the creek. I sat there for the longest time, and when I found the creek, I came out at a big bend pool. And there was just enough gray dusk light to see the surface. It looked like chrome. And there were rings all over it. I looked in the sky, and there were mayflies, and there were trout rising. And I sat there and sobbed, and I said, thank you, this is my life. This is life presented for me. I went back home. My best friend, neighbor, lived, our backyards butted against each other. And he said, I have a place out like that. I call it my chapel in the woods. Years later, after he moved here, I'm at a fly fishing show in Denver, and there's also an Indian market. And I knew one of the guys who makes silver turquoise jewelry, and we happened to end up at the same bar to have a drink afterwards. We talked about how the fishing was going, and he said, well, where are you from? And I told him. He said, it must be nice in the woods up there. And I said, it's beautiful. And I told him that story. When I finished, he had tears coming down his cheeks. He reached out and took my hand and says, my brother, you have met the Spirit, and it will always be with you. That's what fishing does for me. I feel closer to my spirit. Not something that someone else says I should feel. It's not a name put to it by man. It's my spirit who I think guides me. Since that time, James, I have not been afraid of the rest of my life because my spirit is with me.
All right, well, that's what I have for everybody today. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least enjoyed hearing AK and Trevor and Keith tell some of their stories.
No, that was great. I'm really glad you included pieces of the oral history project. That was one of the ways I found out about the archive was finding that clip from Keith, because I was looking up things about Keith. So thank you for sharing your stories and your adventures. There haven't been any questions come in, but I did open it up to if any of the audience members want to share a fishing or angling story of their own, to share either in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll allow you to talk while you share your story. But in the meantime, you mentioned 6 continents. I'm assuming it wasn't Antarctica. Is that the one that's missing, or?
That is true, yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Do you have plans to go?
I don't know that I have plans to go necessarily. I mean, I wouldn't mind it. There's an island just off the coast where apparently the British had planted some rainbow trout, and they're survived. They do sea runs there. So you could certainly do it. Yeah, I think it'd be neat to be able to catch them on all 7 continents. But yeah, I think it'd be fun.
That would be pretty cool. Actually, I know a researcher in the ecology department studies Weddell seals down. Is it Weddell? I think it's Weddell seals. Yeah, so he's been going down, I think every year to study them. So maybe you could catch a ride.
Yeah.
Don't know if it's the same location, but that's a talk we're having in the fall that I'm looking forward to. What has been your favorite trip? I mean, just generally, I know that's probably a big question, 30 countries and 6 continents, but what sticks out in your mind besides the ones that you've already shared with us?
I mean, so altogether, I've been to about 83 countries around the world. And I've fished in about 30, but I've done interviews in probably 60, maybe a little bit more than that. It all depends. Cambodia is one of my favorite places on earth. It's amazing. The beaches are great. The food's incredible. The people are incredibly friendly. But there's certainly places in Africa I love. Morocco's just great. Again, wonderful food. I got to go to Rick's Cafe in Casablanca, which was neat.
Cool.
It's just a replica from the movie, but
Right.
it was still cool. But Sri Lanka has the best beaches I've ever seen on earth. Australia and New Zealand are nice. I lived in Palau for a while. That was pretty cool. It's a little tropical island in between Guam and the Philippines. But I mean, it's tough to beat Rome or Paris or something like that. So
Fair.
there's great places wherever you go.
Okay. Maybe I'm just out of curiosity, just because you've traveled so much, what was maybe your least successful trip? Do you have one that sticks out in your mind as that was not a good trip?
So I on one trip to Africa, it just was luck of the draw. I both caught malaria and got mugged, and that was unpleasant. I don't recommend catching malaria. I just don't recommend it. I mean, I survived, and I did still, even though I was in the throes of it, went out and got my interviews done because I was there, and I'm not going to miss them. And as soon as I started to recover, as soon as I started to feel better, I flew to Ethiopia, and I was there to do some interviews. And I went out for dinner one night, and I had my wallet stolen. So that was kind of a bummer because I had my cash and my credit cards and everything, and it was what it was. I mean, it was, I should have put it in my front pocket like I normally do, but was still a little bit disorientated, I guess. And from
the malaria, right? Yeah.
So that was one of the more, that was a rough trip.
Yes.
And one thing I found out, I got some money wired to me in Ethiopia, and more than I needed to use in Ethiopia. But almost everywhere I've gone in the world, you can always exchange it back at the airport. I've never had a problem. Ethiopia, they won't do that. they're like, no, you keep it. We want your dollars. So I think, yeah, I still have a roll of Ethiopian money in my desk drawer. So
There we
if
go.
anybody's going, let me know.
Right, you could put it in the books for the giveaway. Well, I haven't had any questions come in. So maybe, I don't know, any final story while we give everybody like one more minute to submit their questions. Otherwise, thank you for doing this. We appreciate it.
So I'd say if I had advice for folks who want to travel,
Perfect.
one of the things I always recommend is, if you can pick up a couple of words of the local language, that's great. That's always, people really appreciate it if you can learn to say hello or thank you or something in their native tongue. Be open to experiencing a new culture. One of the things I often hear from tourists is, well, this isn't like the States. Well, that's why you left, is to experience something that wasn't like the States. And one of the best pieces of advice I got was, if you want to know a culture, eat what they eat. My first trip to India, I'm from the Midwest. I grew up on, kind of meat and potatoes, and was not my mother considers spaghetti exotic. And I literally brought, like, one of my bags was filled with like Lunchables and granola bars, because I thought, I don't want to eat that food. Tried it, loved it. It's like I can cook chicken tikka masala and butter chicken. It's one of the things that I really enjoyed. But I became a much more adventurous eater. So if you really want to know a place, really want to know a culture, eat local foods and push your limits a bit. I've tried the cuy, the guinea pig in Peru. It's not bad. It's a little freaky because they leave the head on, so it's staring at you with those little teeth the whole time. I've had ant egg tacos in Mexico. They are delicious. I don't recommend the blood soup in the Philippines. It tastes exactly like you would think it would taste, real minerally and thick.
I was going to say iron, tastes like iron. Okay.
I've had wood grubs in Myanmar. They're not bad. They're a little freaky because they're still moving. Crickets in various places. I've had horse meat when I was in Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
But, don't be afraid to try some local dishes, some street food, and, what we consider normal it's all perspective on culture, right?
Absolutely. So. Yeah. No, that's really good advice. When was your first trip? Well, we're talking a little bit about your travel,
Sure.
the whole thing.
When I was a kid, I went to Canada, but
Canada.
beyond that, when I was in college, my first trip was, I went with some buddies. We went over to Amsterdam,
Okay.
and with some friends from college, and it was fun. Yeah, we had a great time, and we were gonna go. We went a little bit around the country, a little bit around Germany. Spent about 8 days over there. Broke college students, staying in hostels and things like that. But it was a wonderful experience. I would. Europe is just really wonderful to experience. What I always tell my freshman students is, get out and do stuff. If you have the opportunity, you'll never have less responsibility than you have right now. And, go out there and check it out and have adventures and live your life, because you're going to wake up tomorrow and you're going to be 40 and it's going to go like that. But
That's
anyway.
good advice. Yeah. We did get a question.
Oh, great.
See, I knew if we just
Sure.
kept holding it on. So first, Annette says she really enjoyed your story, so thank you.
Great.
And then Evelyn says, thank you for an interesting presentation. Do you have lots of time to fish locally? Do you get to Wisconsin still? And have you fished the drift list? And that actually ties into one of my follow-up questions was, if you work in the archives and fishing is like your job, what do you do for a hobby?
So I don't get out as fish as much as I'd like. Unfortunately, like in this past year in June, my house burned down.
Oh my gosh.
So this past year, I haven't really fished much. I live off grid. I'm out in Clarkston. So all my power comes from solar. All my water comes from rain catch. Excuse me. So the last 6-7 months, I rebuilt another house. And I did most of that work myself. So I swung a lot of hammers this summer and this fall. But normally, yeah, I do like to get out and fish Montana. My favorite river in Montana is the West Boulder. I just love it. I fished a little bit in the driftless area. I got my undergraduate degree at UW La Crosse. So I fished a little bit in that area, not as much as I would like to experience. I grew up fishing in northern Wisconsin. So the first trout I caught were brook trout, which are native there. It fished a lot on the Great Lakes. And I do get back, my mother still lives back there. I've got some rental properties in Milwaukee that I get back to on occasion. And I miss the cheese curds and the Friday fish fries and things like that. But
cheese curds are great.
Yeah. And if you've never had them deep fried, you've got to give it a shot.
Yeah. Even like A&W deep fried cheese curds are like, it gives you an idea, but it's like a distant idea. Of what
Yeah.
Like.
If you ever get to Wisconsin, those are the things that I absolutely recommend are
Awesome.
The deep fried cheese curds. And if you get a chance to get some custard somewhere. And then on Friday, they have local fish fries, and it's usually local fish like walleye and perch. And they're pretty amazing. Not the healthiest diet. Westerners probably aren't known for healthy diets, but it is delicious food.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I think there's no more questions. So I'll do a quick plug for the next presentation next Thursday. Leah Elwell, she is the director of the Stop Invasive Species Action Network over in Livingston. She's going to be speaking on whirling disease. So it's not as much in the news anymore. So she's going to kind of take us through the narrative of whirling disease, what it is, where it came from, why and how it impacted Montanan rivers and Montanans themselves, and just the political landscape of that series of events. It's a big plot point in the book, Royal Wolf Murders. Hopefully everybody here has read it, and hopefully they liked it. So yeah, the 11th is with Leah. The Crafternoons with Wendy Marquis have opened for registration. So we have 2 events. They're take-home kits, but she'll walk you through painting a royal wolf fly on a big Montana Reclaimed Lumber panel. So it's kind of, it could be a big piece of art that you create yourself. And then Keith McCafferty will be doing an online talk on the 25th. So registration for all of those events is open. And after I end that webinar, it'll take you to a survey. If you have a minute just to answer at least like how you found out about it, that would help me. And thanks for being here. Jim, thank you so much. It's lovely to work with you on this. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in person, maybe at the archive. So
yeah, that'd be great. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I always enjoy talking fishing. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next time.